Hi, Joe. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, really kind of a question here that's been a really important ongoing issue. And I'm going to ask you from a different tack than most people address this. How did demographics and globalization drive wealth inequality and low inflation?
Wow, there's a there's a loaded question. Okay, so uh, we've talked before about the dependency ratio. Dependency ratio being the ratio of dependents to the working age population. So the dependents are these two cohorts of people over 65 and under 16, and then you've got the working age population, which has to produce enough to satisfy their own demand plus the demand of the two other cohorts that don't really produce anything. So we've talked about how that can have an impact on wages, just a supply and demand issue. You've got fewer workers trying to provide goods for a larger group of people who aren't working. So that's that part of it. And so globalization, how do we drive inequality with this? Well, first of all, let me just say this. Inequality is one of those things that is really a slippery topic. It's hard to nail down as to how exactly a big a problem it is, and how it came about. I've seen multiple explanations about inequality and its rise over the last 20, 30 years, really over the last 20 years, I think. Some of them are very satisfying. Some of them sound like just so much BS. A lot of it is politics. There's a lot of politics involved in this too. So I think you have to be really careful about how you think about this thing. But here's one thing I'm pretty sure of. We've had a political outcome, the rise of populism, that was very obviously driven by this inequality issue, even if it wasn't called that by the people who used it to achieve political power. There's no doubt in my mind that the rise of Donald Trump can be directly tied to the plight of those workers, middle class workers, and who were hurt by globalization. Look, there are winners and losers in any type of economic change. And I think that what happened through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s with globalization, the people who were the losers were not. We didn't think about them enough, I think is a good way to put it. And listen, I will say this: I'm a free market guy. I love free trade. I think all of this stuff is big picture is the right thing to do, and it's the right way to organize an economy. But I have to admit that I didn't think about who would be hurt by globalization, who would be hurt by more freer trade. Yeah, there are benefits and there are there's benefits and cost. And I think we all forgot about the cost and just focused on the benefits. At least a lot of us did in the free market camp. So put that out of the way. So starting in the 80s, but especially in the 90s after NAFTA was passed, globalization or outsourcing or whatever you want to call it definitely rose compared to the 50s, 60s, 70s when the U.S. economy was more closed. Starting really in the 70s, actually, I mean, you can go back and think about the automobile industry here in the United States and the problems that the U.S. automobile industry Detroit had in the 70s and 80s because of competition from Japan. And there were measures taken during the 80s by the Reagan administration to ameliorate some of that. But the real big push here, the thing that really drove the inequality issue, started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the introduction of all those people in Eastern Europe into the global trading system around 1990. You took a large group of well-educated people who had been kind of outside the global trading system, outside the global economy, and suddenly integrated them into the global economy. You added to the labor pool in a big way. In a sense, what these Eastern European countries had was people, well-educated people who were talented and so forth. They had labor. They didn't have capital. And so the West provided the capital, the Eastern Europeans provided the people, and suddenly you expand the labor pool. Well, if you expand the supply of workers, you know what's going to happen. Now, I think there are, some things that we did here in the United States, I think to kind of, soften that blow, I suppose. But I think a lot of us were just excited that suddenly all these millions of people were no longer under the heel of communism. So I think maybe we forgot about the people that they were going to integrate with. And then it comes along through the 90s too, China, and especially after 2000, after they joined the WTO, which I think, by the way, was a huge mistake. We should have never let them into the WTO because they don't play by the rules. I think that's the one thing. But the other thing is that they were still at a stage of development where they didn't belong in the WTO. But that's neither here nor there because it happened. So what did you do? Between those Eastern Europeans and the Chinese, you essentially doubled the size of the global labor force. And really, we're talking about usually not highly skilled jobs, factory workers and so forth. Look, it takes some skill. It's not, it's not a no-skill job. But a lot of the manufacturing that gets done in China and all these other places was manufacturing that used to happen here. And it stopped happening here because it was cheaper to go to China, Mexico, Vietnam, Korea, any of these other places that you could go. And so what happened was we had a whole group of people here that had to transition from a relatively high pay manufacturing job to a service job that probably didn't pay them as much and certainly didn't have the benefits that they had as a factory worker, say in Detroit or in a steel plant in Pittsburgh or whatever the case may be. So I think that that was really the primary driver of this inequality issue that we have today. And it's interesting in a way because to me it's kind of more of in a way, I guess, a natural phenomenon. Driven by demographics, driven by globalization. Now, globalization obviously was a choice, but what else were we going to do? Especially with the Eastern Europeans, we're going to lock them out of the global economy. You can't do that. And we had this idea that permeated, I think, the geopolitical thinkers of the 90s, that if you take these countries like China and trade with them, that they will become more democratic and freer and so forth. Well, that didn't really work out. But that's really the genesis of my argument about why inequality is where it is. It was really a combination of those two things.
So a lot of it was the kind of surge in the labor population, the global labor population, and that had a downward pressure on wages here in the U.S. as well as encouraged, offshoring and outsourcing. Correct?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, countries that avoided that, who kept their wages high, countries like Germany, well, Germany took advantage of the euro situation. The euro was introduced to replace the Deutschmark. And essentially, they introduced a weaker currency for the German economy. And so I think there were some countries that protected themselves to some degree. The Germans are, a society that that values order much more than the United States. The United States can be a very chaotic place. We kind of let the chips fall where they may, so to speak. Which, like I said, I'm a free market guy. That's the way I like to see things happen. But again, I think, we forgot about some of the people who got left behind here. But that's the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And also I think some of this also is rate of change, right? Is that, some of these trends might have just, without this demographic kind of explosion of labor, might have happened over time in a way that's much easier for populations and people and communities to adjust for. But when all of a sudden you take China and drop them in the WTO, or you take the Iron Curtain and knock it down, you've got a very high rate of change that really doesn't allow communities and people to adjust very efficiently. Wouldn't you say rate of change played a role in this?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And look, China into the WTO, and listen, China was already integrating into the global economy anyway. There's a lot of outsourcing happened in the 90s before they were in the WTO, but that just helped them along. But look, think about it, man. Think about if you're, a 55-year-old auto worker or a steel worker who suddenly gets knocked out of his job at 55 years old because the steel plant got moved to Mexico or to China or wherever, or because China is manufacturing so much steel, the rest of the world has to shut down and kind of, that kind of thing. What do you do at 55? You're going to go be a waiter? I'm not sure what that person does. I think that we should have, I think, taken a slower path on this. And listen, I talk about this all the time. In economics, a lot of the problems that we have is because we try to do things too fast. And part of that is our political system. Free market type people were able to gain some foothold in government in the 90s. Look, the 90s kind of, Newt Gingrich, Republican Revolution. I'm not a Newt Gingrich fan, but that's beside the point. You did have a lot of free market types in the Republican Party back then, and they were able to get a foothold. But they were like, oh my gosh, the Republicans hadn't held the House in, I don't know, several decades. I don't know how long. Well, who was the Republican speaker before Newt Gingrich? I can't even remember that person's name. It was Tip O'Neill forever. He was a Democrat. But my point is that because of the political system, I think a lot of politicians feel like I've got this limited time to get this stuff done. We're going to get it done now. And so
Well, sure. And
a lot of these changes happen quickly.
we saw both parties. We saw kind of the leadership of this country really get behind globalization and maybe not think through the impact it was going to have on some communities with the wealth gap and inequality. But those things kind of came in, the good of low inflation and the bad of wealth inequality kind of were a little bit married. They kind of came hand to hand to a degree.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And let me just say, it's interesting. We talk about globalization. Oh, we didn't think about all these people who were going to be hurt. And like I said, there are a lot of people who just think that it's an absolute good. Well, free trade's the only way to go. It's the best thing to do. Yeah, but you got to think about the politics of it. And I don't think anybody in 1990, when we signed NAFTA, was thinking about some political populism that was going to happen 25 years later. But here's what's interesting. During the 80s, when we were negotiating some of these first trade deals and so forth in the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, there were people, particularly in the Reagan administration, who said, look, we have to take care of steel workers and so forth. We've got to take care of this. We can't just let these companies just outsource this stuff and just can these people. And there was actually a bill at one point that would have compensated, and it was very specifically about steel workers through the union, and the union negotiated this thing, and it got lopped off. It didn't get passed. Biggest mistake, political mistake that was made at the time, I think. Now, it would have been temporary. It was a payoff, basically. But, it was enough where it would allow that 55-year-old guy we were talking about earlier, would allowed him to have a transition capital to go do something else, whether it was go to learn how to do something else or start a business or whatever the case may be. And we took it away. We didn't do it. And we decided it was too expensive or something. Yeah, well, we're finding out now what the cost is, and it's pretty steep.
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate this because I do think demographics drove a lot of this. But you go back to the German model, where what they did with the euro kind of kept their currency in check. I've always thought we kind of did the exact opposite with the export-led development model. We kind of struck a deal of we'll buy goods from you and you'll buy debt from us. In that exchange of treasuries and certainly Japan, China. In my mind, you accuse them of currency manipulation. Well, there's a partner there. It's the U.S. government that's selling lots of treasuries and using that, those governments to finance debt.
Well, you know what? I don't want to go down that path because I'm going to tell you something. It's a little bit of a fait accompli here. Look, we are the world's reserve currency, and we have been for a long time. Since the end of Bretton Woods, we are the world's reserve currency. Kind of the trade-off there is that we do have to run a trade deficit in a sense because we got to put enough dollars out in the world so that people can trade because they need the dollars outside the United States to trade. And that's part of the Triffid dilemma and all that stuff. I mean, it's almost a necessity for us to run a trade deficit. And you can trace that back to the end of Bretton Woods. And you can see our trade deficit starts to grow right after we come off of Bretton Woods, and it just continues. So I don't want to say that we necessarily did something specifically to make that true. However, I would say in the 1990s, we had a policy, a very explicit policy, strong dollar policy. Robert Rubin, the guy, every time he got in front of a microphone, he said strong dollar. And usually multiple times he'd say, blah, 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 strong dollar, blah, 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 strong dollar. And he would end on strong dollar. The dude was out there. And that was his way of getting rid of the bond vigilantes. And he was like, if we can keep the dollar strong, we can keep inflation down. And yeah, it did attract people to buy bonds. But, in a way, there's no choice. If China, for instance, runs a trade surplus with us, they've got excess dollars and they got to go somewhere. And so they end up in the bond market. They could have ended up anywhere else. It's not the Chinese have to do it. The dollar still exists. They could have traded the dollars for something else from some other country, and then that other country would have to invest in the U.S. It doesn't matter. The dollars get created during that transaction. So in a way, we kind of have to do that. It also means, by the way, that there's a limit to how long this can go. And it's why reserve currencies last so long and then they fail, because you get too much debt out there and too much. Because if you run a trade deficit, you're running a current account deficit, probably, particularly if you're running a budget deficit, and you just end up in deeper and deeper in debt. So, I don't know. I don't think we're at that point right now. I don't think we're really close to that yet, but we do have a lot of debt. And I will say this, traditionally, historically, the way to get rid of debt like this is to inflate it away. So regardless of how we ended up here, I'm not surprised in the least if we end up with a higher inflation rate trying to get rid of this debt. We can tell ourselves, and listen, it may not even be intentional. It may just be the way it happens. But you're going to need an inflation rate that deflates this debt. And listen, we've already seen it. Debt as a percentage of GDP is coming down now. Why? Because we got inflation of 8%. So we'll see how that goes. Look, I do think that there are countries that, listen, this was also, this accumulation of reserves and accumulation of dollars was also driven by the experience of the 1998 Asian crisis. Remember, Thailand, the baht famously was kind of the trigger there, but you ended up with Russia defaulted and all this other stuff. So these countries that were running these trade surpluses, they had to, well, the prescription was, hey, let's avoid this Thai problem by accumulating a sufficient amount of reserves so that if we do get a run on the currency, we can deal with it. So part of this is, not driven necessarily by the U.S., although one could argue, I suppose, that the strong dollar policy of Robert Rubin is what triggered those crises in '98. But regardless, I think it's just a natural response.
Sure. And so to tie this up, we did see demographics and globalization really play a role in maybe a very rapid change in employment and labor power that led to some of this wealth inequality, also led to low inflation. But we're also now starting to see reversals of those trends, some for good and some for bad.
Well, and look, that's our thesis here. Look, part of this is political. It's being driven by politics. There's no doubt about that. And part of it is being driven by geopolitics, the idea that we don't want to work with China so closely anymore, I suppose. But, these things do reverse. They are reversing. And if we know what we got going in the other direction, which was disinflation and some inequality, I think we're going to get the opposite when we go in the other direction. It's not rocket science.